And then since you're hurting yourself, you do end up hurting everybody else too. And it's this weird rabbit hole that you go down. But you have to understand that you will not grow as much as you want to if you are not willing to look in these mirrors without your ego.
Yes, you do have an ego, just like Kevin, just like myself. Maybe your ego is the turtle shell. Maybe you constantly convince yourself you're worse than you really are, so you don't even have to try.
Next Level Nation, welcome back to another very special, as always, weekly NLU live podcast for week number 99. Almost 100. We are talking about overcoming the ego you think you don't have. So usually Alan and I go back and forth when it comes to what we're going to do on these live podcasts, because although they're podcasts, we try to treat them like they are speeches and like they're keynotes. And Alan came up with this idea, I believe. So Alan, I'm going to let you explain why you came up with this and what your goal with this is.
The first thing to understand here is if you think you don't have an ego, that's your ego. So every human being has an identity, and they're really broken into, in my opinion, three separate parts. The first one is what you think you are versus what you really are. So who you think you are versus who you really are, and the distance between those two. And then it goes even deeper of who you want others to think you are. So there's who you want others to perceive you as, there's who you want to perceive yourself as, and then there's who you really are, and the distance between those. So the reason why I wanted to do this is because I think this is a very misunderstood concept. Kevin and I obviously do podcasts and speeches on success and what it really takes. Success, or ego rather, is the success inhibitor. There are people out there that think they're already totally good enough. And while I understand what they're saying intrinsically, they don't know enough. They don't work hard enough. They do have to work on themselves. They do have to learn. They do have to grow. All of us, our results in our life, health, wealth, and love, are predicated on the level at which we are currently playing at. And if you think you're already enough, it's kind of inaccurate, and a lot of that is ego because, quite frankly, Kevin and I have to get better at business, better as men, better characters, better at intimate relationships, better at lifting, strength, all these things. But at the same time, we are still intrinsically enough. And so ego is a drastically misunderstood part of the human condition. We all have one. We all have an identity of who we think we are versus who we really are. And some people think they suck, and they're actually pretty great. Other people think they're great, and they actually kind of suck. And what I mean by that, rather than great and suck, that's obviously a little bit black and white. What I mean by that is that very few of us are living in the truth of what really is. And that's because of what we're going to talk about today. So if I think I'm a great speaker right now, I think that that's true in some capacity, but is it really true? And am I looking at the feedback around me to confirm or deny that? Am I looking for evidence? Do I have legs underneath that table, so to speak? Because who you believe you are is very different than who other people believe you are, which is even more different probably than who you actually are. And so the closer you get to the truth of who you really are, self-awareness, the less ego you have. I had a coach one time, his name was Alex, and he said, Alan, people who succeed at the highest levels are the ones who can handle the most truth. The most truth about themselves, the most truth about the world, the most truth in general. And that's really what this is about, is the ego is a protection mechanism to keep you from the truth of your own reality. When you want to think you're in great shape, but you're really not, that's holding you back from going out to the gym. When you think you're not a good speaker when you really could be, that's holding you back from even trying. And so the ego is a drastically misunderstood concept. The ego is the enemy, and it holds us all back from our true potential, which is just so unacceptable.
Alan, for some reason, Facebook's jeffing. It's going to be all right. We're going to roll. We're going to roll here.
Make it work.
I remember Alan, myself, and our buddy Alex Hinkle, we were in Florida. And I'll never forget, you, me, Alex, and Eddie were working out downstairs at Eddie's apartment complex in the gym. And being in the gym, and we're talking about ego, being in the gym is one of the places that I have more of an ego than normal. My identity in the gym is somebody who's crushing it, somebody who is in better shape than many people, somebody who has a ton of reps there. So my ego in the gym is higher. You've heard us talk about the drive to 5. If you're low on the drive to 5, you lack confidence. You're somebody who is afraid to ask for help. You don't feel worthy. You probably have low self-worth. If you're high on the drive to 5, is probably the opposite of that. But for this analogy, I'm just going to use the drive to 5 from an ego perspective. So in the gym, when I'm getting after it, particularly when I'm working out with 3 or 4 other people, my ego is pretty high. Not in an arrogant way, but in a very sure of myself, I'm the best in the room kind of way. Now, we were working out, and I'll never forget, I felt so good. I felt awesome. It's Florida. It's warm. We're looking good. And then we sat down after and started talking about business. And I'll never forget, and I was really exploring my ego at this point. When we sat down to talk about business, I remember actually physically shelling up. I remember feeling that I went from having my chest up and confident to shelling up. And it's because I was super insecure. And my ego was trying to protect me from that insecurity. So my first point, understand what your ego is trying to protect you from and how you react. So I, in that moment, realized, okay, when I get insecure and we're talking about business or we're talking about maybe speaking early on or coaching or money, I tend to shell up and get very, very, very quiet. Where if we're talking about podcasting and I believe I know more than somebody, I might go a little past 5 to make a point. And everything, again, I always say this during the live podcast more than anything else, everything we talk about really is self-awareness. At the end of the day, it is hyperconsciousness. And if you can understand and get in the present moment and say, okay, wait, I feel like my ego is taking over here. What's happening? What's actually happening here? So another story in Florida, Alan and I were doing an interview with a couple former Marines. And I remember during the interview, and this is how it works. This is the process of how it goes from one thing to another. During the interview, I got insecure because Alan was asking more questions than I was. After the interview, I said, Alan, what you did in there wasn't good for the brand. You swore way more than usual. Alan egoed up and said, Kev, I didn't swear more than usual. You're just insecure because you didn't get to ask your questions. I guarantee when we listen back, it'll be better than you think. We both cried on the way to yoga, and then we sat through yoga without looking at each other or thinking of one another. And then I think after we went back and we listened to the episode, and it was kind of what I expected. I said, Alan, it's going to be pretty bad. You swore a lot. So Alan was very confident, probably over 5 on his ego. When I'm with Alan and Alan goes over 5, I go under 5 to balance him out. So the point I'm making here is understand how you react to ego as well. And Alan and I had a wonderful conversation after, and it was great. But you can see how me feeling insecure brought me into my ego. The way I communicated with Alan was different because my ego was driving. Alan's ego was driving. We both cried, and I'll talk about that later. And then we reconnected from a different point. So we all react differently to ego. You have to understand how you do, and you have to understand how yours is trying to protect you. That is my first point. I know it was all over the place, but hopefully it connected.
It did connect. Kev, so the drive to 5, that was such a perfect example of trying to find the truth.
Yeah.
Your insecurity probably made you think I swore more than I really did. My arrogance probably made me think I swore less than I really did. And then we afterwards got to find the actual truth after our conversation. And the vulnerability is the opposite of ego. The vulnerability of us both crying, I know you probably have a point about that, but vulnerability is the cure to ego. Because the person who's insecure becomes vulnerable and lives more in the truth. That's what vulnerability is. Vulnerability is, listen, this is what's going on with me right now. You know what? Honestly, yeah, I'm sorry. That was my ego. That wasn't true. I lied about that, or I screwed that up. I'll tell this quick story. I was in by the lake several summers ago with Emilia. This is the first summer we were together, so this is probably a year ago. And when I'm by the lake, I swim. I run. I wake up. I run, and then I'll swim because there's no gym, and I want to exercise every single day. And I remember it was like raining, and I swam out from the dock and then back to the dock. And I think it was 3 times, and I went pretty far distance or whatever. And when I was telling the story later that night to Emilia, I ended up saying I did it 4 times. And then right after, I was like, why the hell did I say that? That's not true. I actually did it only 3 times. And I promised Emilia at the very beginning of our relationship, I will never lie to you. And so I always come clean. And so I just said, sweetheart, I know that you don't care because it's not a big deal. But the truth is I only swam 3 times, and I'm outside of integrity by not making sure I say that. And again, that ego of trying to lie and say I did it 4 times rather than 3, that embellishment is a overcorrection to an insecurity that I'm not good enough if I only did 3. Versus someone who is insecure and doesn't even try to swim because they don't think they're good enough. So it's all a protection and defense mechanism. And there's a lot of psychological stuff going on here. There's cognitive dissonance, and there's something called emotive family therapy, or emotive family systems, that I'm going to go into now. All right, so if you've ever seen the movie Good Will Hunting, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. If you have not seen it, spoiler alert, but also go watch it because it's such a tremendous character study of someone who struggled with trauma as a child and overcompensated with ego, and then eventually started to live more and more and more in the truth. It's a beautiful transformation. So there's this scene where Robin Williams, R.I.P., is with Matt Damon's character, Good Will Hunting in this case, Will Hunting, and Robin Williams says to Will, you know, you're better, because he's smoking. He's like, no smoking in my office. And in this case, Robin Williams is the psychiatrist, if you've never seen the movie. And he says, you know, you're better off throwing that cigarette up your butt than smoking it. And he literally immediately turns to him and says, yeah, you know what? It really gets in on my yoga. And you can see how I'm pretending to have an ego right there, because I'm simulating what Matt Damon was doing in that scene. See, that was his protector came up. I'm going to explain protector really quickly. So we interviewed someone named Carol Gillen, and she's studied this. She's a psychiatrist and a therapist. And she talked about how there's all these different parts of us. We all have all these different parts, but there's only one part of you driving. So if there's a part of you right now that wants a Big Mac and a large fry, then that part of you isn't driving. Otherwise, unless you're in the drive-thru right now listening to this. So my point is we all have these parts, and they all have this advice that they give us. Okay, so sometimes your emotions are driving, sometimes your fears are driving, sometimes your aspirations are driving. And so Carol Gillen says we have all these parts, but 2 of the parts are to protect us from ourselves. And so one of the parts is called a protector. Makes sense. It's a front. It's a persona. It's a facade. It's when Robin Williams called him out for smoking cigarettes, his ego protector came up and said, oh yeah, it really gets in on my yoga. Like kind of making fun of him for poking at that insecurity. So what the protector's purpose is to keep what she referred to as an exile away. And you can study this. It's called IFS if you want. Emotive Family Systems, I believe is what it's called. I think I might have. Internal Family Systems, I think. I really got to figure that out. Okay, so the way she described an exile was really powerful. She said it's like a beach ball that from your past that you're trying to hold underwater. So for example, if you have a deep belief that you're not intelligent enough, you most likely have a protector that comes up anytime someone asks you an intellectual question. And you either avoid it or you shell up. That's because you have a protector that's protecting you from this exile. This exile is this deep insecurity or fear that you're not smart enough or you're not good enough. So if you're one of those people who had trouble raising your hand in class, most likely you have some sort of a trauma that made you feel like you weren't good enough or not smart enough. So now you're never going to be embarrassed again. You're never going to ask a dumb question again or whatever. So the exile is like a beach ball that you're holding underwater, and it takes a lot of energy. And what she explained to us on the episode was that eventually this beach ball, when you let go of it, it's going to splash everybody. And so those are what Kevin's referring to as these triggers. In that scene, Robin Williams' character triggered the insecurity of Matt Damon's character. And then Matt Damon lashed back. The protector came up rather than him getting vulnerable and saying, you know what? yeah, I do have an addiction to cigarettes. And you know what? Honestly, cigarettes are bad for me. And honestly, I've wanted to quit for quite some time. I just can't seem to do it yet. Can you help me? See how that's vulnerability versus this ego of pretending cigarettes aren't bad and that it doesn't matter? And so that's really what we're talking about here today. Remember, everyone has an ego. It just manifests in all these different forms, and all ego holds people back.
I've said this on the podcast before, Alan, and it was like a joke for us for a while because of the brutal nature of it. But back when we were co-hosting Top Notch Live, Taryn and I did a check-in, and I think so we would rate each other from 0 to 10 on how we were meeting each other's needs. And when it came to I think it was love and connection, she said on a scale of 1 to 10, I feel like I've gotten that need met on a 3. And she said, you've been putting so much time into everything, and you've been staying up late, and you've been doing all these things to get tickets sold to Top Notch Live. It's just so much. And I remember my ego flared, and my natural reaction was to say, like, do you have any idea what I'm doing, how hard this is? That BS that we all find popping up. And like Alan said, he said I was going to talk about crying. So I went over, right? Taryn was very vulnerable with me, telling me how she felt. In order to protect myself and not take ownership for what I have caused, I went over 5, and I overreacted. Now, that only lasts so long before you realize, oh, I definitely did something bad here. Then you have to be vulnerable in order to reconnect. And that's what I had to do there. And you have to understand, whether you're going from an ego, so an arrogant to a vulnerability, or from a very vulnerable, scared place to confidence, it requires courage on both ends. But I think that you really, really have to understand the seesaw of what you're creating. So anytime Alan and I have an argument, we always drive to 5, like he said earlier, and one of us goes vulnerable and one of us comes down. It always seems to work that way. I think that if you're out there, you have to understand that when your ego is driving, particularly on an arrogant side, you're hiding from something, and this is when you hurt people. Genuinely, this is when you hurt people's feelings, and you can, in some instances, change the way they look at you. And that's why you have to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is the key to so many things, and vulnerability does dictate, I believe, the quality of your relationship, because you can be your true, authentic self. I can't tell you how many of these tough conversations Taryn and I have had where I end up crying because I think I overshot my ego, or Alan and I in business. This has happened so many times. So I want you to understand that when you're facing your ego, whether it's from a place of lack or a place of overshooting, it's going to require a lot of courage. And around some people, they might not understand or recognize that courage, but it will require courage. And it's strong to face your ego, not weak. It's a benefit to face your ego, not anything opposite of that. And it really is the key to your relationships, because a lot of it is emotional mastery. You're stopping what your natural tendency is. So if your natural tendency is to say, I'm way better than you, and here's 5 reasons why, it's probably not true. It's probably not true. You're trying to protect yourself. So understand that it's going to take courage, and the only way to do this is to practice it. I would say try to practice it when the stakes are small, because when you get heated, that's when things get jeffed, for sure.
And I actually have a really exciting live event coming up in Boston. If you can come visit us, I'm joining my friends at Next Level University, and I would love to meet you all. And that is on March 26th. So get your tickets soon.
So I'll tell another story here real quick. So I had a dear friend and a client now, and if she's listening, she'll remember this. And we were at a modeling shoot, and she was an athlete and a sprinter growing up, and she's much smaller than I am. I'm 6'2", and she's I think 5'2" or something like that. But somehow, playfully, it came up that she thought she would be faster in a race than me. And to be completely transparent with everyone and vulnerable here, back in high school, I hit puberty really late. I was not naturally talented at athletics back then, and I didn't grow. I think in freshman year I was like 5'4" or something like that, and by junior year I was 6'2", but I didn't hit puberty till very late. I still look very young, and so I have this insecurity still that I'm working through, and I feel very much like I've overcome it to a great extent now. But this is several years ago when I was doing fitness modeling, and I got triggered because she thought she could outsprint me. She thought she was faster than me. And I remember I got like triggered and I egoed up. And I said, no chance. It won't even be close. And she was like, okay, let's do it. And so she egoed back up. And we ended up doing it. And yes, I won. And I did know that I would. But after, I remember feeling like crap. And we actually did it multiple times, Kev. We did a race on the beach multiple times. This photo shoot was like by a lake near a beach. And both of our egos disconnected us. And we're fine and we're good. And we were even good that day. But there was that little boy part of me that wanted to, I couldn't believe that she didn't see me as athletic. But I remember what it felt like to feel so insignificant compared to the athletes back in high school when I was the nerdy kid with straight A's that no one seemed to care about. And again, none of this has anything to do with her. It has to do with my own self-awareness and my own past traumas and my own feelings of being insignificant. And Kevin and I earlier today, we were reviewing some past episodes, and we were in the hundreds, then we were in I think we reviewed 171, and then we were in the 200s. We can progressively see and hear less and less and less ego on the journey. And I believe that tell in our voice is predicated on the amount of personal growth we've experienced. The cognitive dissonance between who we're pretending to be versus who we really are is smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And I don't mean pretending to be as in we're actively, consciously pretending right now, because we're not. We weren't back then either. We were just younger men with bigger egos. Not because we actually statistically had huge egos. I don't necessarily believe that. What I believe is that all of us are on this self-awareness inner journey of consistently and sustainably overcoming that which we are insecure about through actual mastery. And so the solution to ego, this again, just to bring you back, the title of this is Overcoming the Ego You Think You Don't Have. So step one is, yes, you do have an ego, just like Kevin, just like myself. Maybe your ego is the turtle shell. Maybe you constantly convince yourself you're worse than you really are, so you don't even have to try. Or maybe you're the pufferfish. Maybe you're pretending to be awesome, so you don't even have to try. If you're awesome already, why even bother? Why try? And so, number one is you do have an ego. What is it, and what's your tendency? I'm going to transition to my next point. We have a couple that we've been working with for a really long time. Emilia and I do relationship talks coaching, and we coach married couples, intimate relationship couples. And one of the couples that we've been working with for a really long time, so our business is called The We, and we have something referred to as Weemons. And so as long as you live, remember these three animals. Two of them exist, one of them's made up. The first one is, again, the turtle shell. When are you turtle shelling up? When should you have courage and try? And where are you not giving yourself credit where it's due? Where are you convincing yourself, I won't win anyway, so why bother? Okay, that's the turtle. Always remember the turtle. Number two is the pufferfish. Where are you pretending to be super strong when in reality you're not that competent? When the shark comes by, the pufferfish puffs up to pretend to be dangerous when in reality the pufferfish knows deep down it's actually very weak and frail. Okay, so remember those two. The Weemon that we created with this couple is called, and if they're listening, they'll think this is funny, is called the turtle puff. Because together, one of them tends to, in a fear state, pufferfish, and the other one, when the pufferfish happens, becomes a turtle. And so they disconnect each other. One of them shells up, the other one pufferfishes, and no one works as a team when that happens. And so what we've taught them to do is to do what we're teaching you to do on this episode, on this podcast, which is identify which you are and when it's happening. What's your tendency? So my tendency is the pufferfish. Kevin's tendency is the turtle shell. That doesn't mean sometimes he doesn't pufferfish and sometimes I don't turtle shell. But the solution is vulnerability. The solution is to identify, okay, this chip on my shoulder, is the chip on my shoulder running me or am I running the chip? Do I want to race this person and prove that I'm faster because of real merit and real value? Or am I just trying to still prove to my younger self that I'm an athlete? Just understand, your insecurities have created strengths to them. I'm serious about this, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper here. I'll tell a quick story. I had a friend of mine who, growing up, got very bullied, very made fun of, and used to work out all the time, way before anyone else was working out. This is the first weight training workout I've ever done was with this person in their basement. And the reason why, when I asked him, why did you start working out so young? He told me, he said, I have these scars on my abs because I had some of my intestines taken out. And I wanted to be ripped so you couldn't see the scars. So you would see abs instead of scars. And I've seen this time and time again. Kevin and I, at this point, listen to in 120 countries, clients all over the world, different countries, different backgrounds, different cultures, different ethnicities, and no one is not one of these two. There's no one I've ever met that doesn't have one of these tendencies. And there's also no one that I've ever met, when you get behind the curtain of their life and their business and their health and their happiness and their relationship, there's no one who doesn't struggle with ego on some level. And there's no one who hasn't created strengths from their insecurities. So if I'm deeply insecure about my athleticism, I've overcompensated by being extra athletic. Kevin, if you don't mind me sharing this, if you were 6'5", I doubt you'd be as in good a shape, because I think because you're short, you probably wanted to be more jacked. And so your insecurities and your quote-unquote weaknesses, they create strengths. And that's okay. That's the human condition. That's a beautiful thing. But once you have the strength, get rid of the insecurity. You know, I didn't need to prove to this person that I was faster. I already knew I was. My little Alan, who's still deeply insecure and undervalued back in high school, is still trying to prove it somehow, right? So just identify when this is happening and overcome it by living in your own truth. And we know when we're in ego versus when we're really being us.
And isn't the truth what you want to be in anyway? I know it can be difficult. And again, you got to dip your toe in the pool before you go all the way in. But I've told this before, but I think this might be the best example of this. Alan and I were in the studio one day, and Alan said, "Hey, Kev, I got to be vulnerable with you for a second." Immediately, ego flare. Like, whoa. What's about to happen? Let me put my dukes up. And he said, "Kev, I've struggled with this my whole life. I've always felt like I've ended up outgrowing people, and I'm afraid I'm going to outgrow you." And again, it's emotional mastery. I'm telling you, I think that's what it is. I've been doing this long enough with Alan where I've been told so many things that could make me feel really bad about me, but oftentimes they have been enough and important enough in the right time given to me truth where I could do something about it. So there's always this inner dialogue of screw this, or you don't get to say that to me, or who do you think you are? But what if it's the truth? If it's the truth and you allow your ego to get into the way, you're not going to grow as much as you should. And that's going to jeff you in the long run anyway. I've told this story too, but again, it's very appropriate for this. We had somebody once in group coaching who said, "You know what, I really feel like this group coaching would be more valuable if I was leading it in my own way, in my own community." And I egoed up. My ego got triggered. I got triggered of not being good enough and calling us out in front of people. And it wasn't terrible. It wasn't bad. But I just remember saying, if you really think that's the way, why don't you go get 100 on your PPT? You're not going to be leading anybody with these 65% scores. Now, that person might say with ego, "Oh, that group coaching didn't help me that much." But what if the truth was you just weren't being consistent And rather than looking at the truth and owning it, you have an ego story up about, well, they didn't help me. It wasn't for me. That changes the perspective of your life if you're willing to look at it. Now, sometimes you'll have an ego flare, and maybe it won't be the truth. Maybe somebody is saying something to you that they shouldn't be saying. Maybe it's not the truth. Maybe they're saying it because their ego is flaring. But if you don't take the truth, you will never have the life that you really want. Genuinely. So many of the conversations Alan and I have about business are difficult. And they're, hey, Kev, I think you might be wrong about this. Or, hey, Alan, I think you're wrong about this. And now we're at the point where we've done it enough times, but I can tell you that if you're hiding from the truth, even if it's subconsciously, even if you're letting your ego run, you're doing yourself a giant, giant disservice. It might not feel like it in the moment. It might feel more pleasurable and less painful, but over the years, you're not going to get to where you want to get to because you're not looking at real data. And I know that's difficult and I know it's hardcore, but again, my goal, Alan's goal, is to be heart-driven but no BS. Some of the most difficult mirrors I had to look in without my ego have made the biggest shifts for me. And they were painful, yes, but you get used to it more and more and more and more. And if you don't look at the truth with a clear vision, you're really hurting yourself more than anybody else. And then since you're hurting yourself, you do end up hurting everybody else too. And it's this weird rabbit hole that you go down. But you have to understand that you will not grow as much as you want to if you are not willing to look in these mirrors without your ego.
So I just want to clarify as well that, again, if you're out there and you're thinking to yourself, I don't struggle with these things, everyone struggles with them, but not to the same extent. Maybe you're extraordinarily self-aware. Maybe you're very good at being vulnerable. But let me bring some context. Everyone I've ever met struggles with this, but usually not in every arena. So I have some early mentors of mine that have zero ego around money and wealth. And usually it's because they're really confident now in their abilities around wealth and money. But yet whenever I would talk fitness, their egos would flare so much. Because usually ego is an overreaction to a lack of competence. And I'm going to go pretty deep because we've been diving pretty deep on this. I believe that all of us have a masculine and a feminine energy within us. And this is not male or female. All of us have a yin and a yang, masculine and feminine. I believe that the deepest fear of the masculine is fear of incompetence, fear of not being good enough at something. I'll never forget, Kevin, we were at the Brendan Burchard event and we saw Natalie Hodson on stage, who we've since interviewed. And she brought up some statistics. And she said in the U.S. particularly, for the masculine, or for males, the deepest insecurity and form of shame is not being successful financially. She said for females, it's body image. And of course, we live in a society that tends to bolster financial success with males and tends to care more about physical attributes with females. My point of all this, shame, guilt, these things, these insecurities, they are the exiles that we were referring to earlier. And when you look at them, when you look at the insecurity, you can now make sure that it's not running you. Make sure that scarcity and fear isn't running you. When the protector comes up, you can recognize it. And maybe you don't have a protector in the gym. Maybe you don't have an ego in the gym. Maybe you don't have an ego with your finances, but maybe you do have an ego with your intimate partner. Or maybe you're deeply insecure about your physique. And whenever people talk about fitness around you, you have to lash out. These ego flares typically happen around topics that trigger deep insecurities. And if you're not self-aware enough to at least ask the questions of what am I ashamed of in my past? What do I feel guilty about? Where was I insecure? And are those insecurities still running me? The next thing that I want to say here before we go, because I know we got to wrap in 5 and go to Q&A. There's 2 types. I think that the antidote to ego is self-awareness, humility, vulnerability. I want to talk a little bit about humility first. There's 2 types of humility. There's inward humility and there's outward humility. So I was on a podcast recently and they were asking me about different goals and dreams, and I talked about the framework that Emilia and I talk about a lot. Kevin talks about it a lot as well. I want to give Emilia credit. She created this. Core aspirations, core values, core beliefs. And they were asking me about my core values. And I have a flashcard in my pocket that has all of my core values. And one of them on there, the 6th one, there's 6. The 6th one is humility in action. And they asked me, what is humility in action? I don't understand. Why not just humility? I said, humility comes in a lot of forms. I want to be humble in my actions. And I'm going to give you an example of someone who isn't. Hypothetical. Imagine a person who, to everyone else, seems pretty modest, seems pretty humble, but inside they think they know it all. So much, in fact, that they're not necessarily learning. So think of someone who always needs to be the leader. Think of this person. They always have to be the leader. They can't ever put the student cap on and just learn. So if Bill Gates and I get in a room, I'm going to put my student cap on and I'm going to learn business. Okay? I'm not going to learn fitness from Bill Gates. So I'm going to put the leader cap on there. Humility in action is a core value of mine because I think it's the antidote to ego. It's the antidote to my tendency of the pufferfish. And I'll give you another example. Yes, I know a lot about finances. Yes, I know a lot about business. Yes, I know a lot about personal development. But I'll be the first to tell you that I don't know how to cook well. I don't know anything about cars. I don't know anything about gardening. There's a lot I don't know about. And so while I can sit here authentically, wholeheartedly telling you that I know so much about finance and so much about business, I'm still reading an economics book by my bedside table. And this book is 850 pages long, and it's one of the most boring books of all time. I'm humble in my actions. See, that's the difference between inward humility and outward humility. See, I can confidently say I'm amazing at finance. I understand numbers and mathematics and calculus and all that stuff very, very well. But I also am studying every day. See, humility in your actions is very different than outward humility of trying to show everybody like you're humble when in reality, inwardly, you think you're arrogant. Very last thing I'll say here. I have a friend of mine who everyone thinks is extremely humble. And he is in certain contexts. But behind the scenes, he thinks he knows it all. And quite frankly, he doesn't. He doesn't know that much. And he doesn't read books. Certainly not as many as he should, in my opinion. Again, that's just my opinion. So there's a difference here between inward humility and outward humility. Quite frankly, if you're not outwardly humble, I would be surprised if you're listening to this show. Inwardly, though, remember, this is overcoming the ego you think you don't have. Inwardly, if you think you know more than Kevin about fitness, inwardly, you are most likely wrong about that. Okay? If you think you know it all, you're definitely wrong about that. See, inward humility, in my opinion, is more important because it's what we don't show others that we think about ourselves that really holds us back.
Alan, I think this is why martial arts is so important. We interviewed Kenny Florian, who's a former mixed martial arts fighter, and he was a commentator with this gentleman named Paul Felder. Paul Felder he is something special. Scary man, but seems like one of the nicest people in the world. And somebody called him out on social media, and there was a lot of ego here. And he said something about if Paul Felder could only fight as good as he could commentate, maybe he would have lasted longer or something. And Paul said, that's not very nice. Would you say that if you saw me in the street? And he said, hell no, I wouldn't say that. I know I'd get my ass kicked. And the reason I'm saying that is there's something extremely humbling about doing a martial art with another human being who could quite literally take your life if they wanted to. So the last point, and this is kind of off the beaten path. I wasn't going to say this, but if you really want to understand your ego, go do something that you're not good at. Go do something that's very, very difficult, and that will quite literally beat humility into you. Whether it's a combat sport or a hard hike or a bike ride or a hard workout, whatever it is, that will take the ego out of you because you're going to be in way over your head, and there is no substitute for that truth. When I used to grapple, there used to be people that would come in, and we would call them the spazzes, because they would just start freaking out and trying to hurt you. They would just spaz out and try to hurt you. And by the end of that grappling session, they were usually pretty humble because they got choked out or they got armbarred or whatever it may be. And there's something very humbling about somebody else having your life in their hands. So that is another thing. That is the last thing I'll say, is understanding and controlling and becoming conscious of the ego that you don't know that you have. Do hard tasks, do hard workouts, hard hikes, whatever it may be. It will really, really draw that part out of you. Next level nation, if you are tuning into this, it is obvious that you want to get to the next level of your life. While we have group coaching and we have a retreat coming up and we have a live event coming up, maybe for you right now, the budget just doesn't want to do that. We also have a free course, totally free on the website. Go to the website, click free course, it'll pop up, enter your email, it's yours. It's an hour and a half worth of content, years of what Alan and I have learned in a free, easy to digest online course. You can take it at your own pace. There's worksheets, they're downloadable, all of that happy jazz. It'll teach you what it takes to really get to the next level of your life, and we want you to have it for free. So go to the website.
One of the best ways to eliminate your ego is to get around other people trying to do the same. You may or may not have heard this. You probably have if you've listened to the show in the last several months. We have an event March 26th, Next Level Live. Super excited because we are going all in on live events again. In-person events. So this event is going to have only 50 tickets sold, 4 speakers, half day, continental breakfast. The venue is gorgeous. If you haven't seen the video, we'll put a link in the show notes. And Aim, do you mind putting the link to the landing page in the comments as well? Please get... Okay, you're the best. Thank you. Please get your ticket as soon as possible because these tickets are more than half gone already. And I'm just excited to meet all of you. So